year around this time, Southern Baptist churches across America collect an offering for international missions. We call it the Lottie Moon Christmas Offering for International Missions. So that means that every year as a pastor, I have to think of ways to encourage you to give, to lay that need before you. And as I thought this year about what am I going to say, I was drawn back to a passage of Scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where the Apostle Paul did something very similar to what I'm trying to do this morning, to lay a need before a congregation, a need that really doesn't affect them, it's about another, a need someplace else. So let's look at what Paul had to say this morning, because I think it's helpful. It's instructive for us. We're going to read 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. And the title of the message is Why Give to Missions? 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. Now the setting here, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, a very affluent church in a very affluent city, and he's telling them about a need somewhere else. All right? And Paul writes this. He says, "And now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. They did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then to us in keeping with God's will. So we urge Titus, since he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But just as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and complete earnestness and in your love for us, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And here is my advice about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what he does not have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. Then there will be equality. As it is written, he that gathered much did not have too much, and he that gathered little did not have too little. I want you to notice, first of all, in the first 6 verses, that Paul praises them for giving according to their means and even beyond their means. He tells the church at Corinth, again, which was a very affluent church in a very affluent area, he tells them of the gifts that the churches in Macedonia have given. Now, Macedonia would be the churches that from the New Testament that we know about: Berea, Philippi, Thessalonica. All of these were churches in a poorer area than the Corinth church, the Corinthian church. But Paul says that they gave beyond what they were able in many cases, and that they had, he says in verse 4, they even begged him for the opportunity to give. You know, one of the just very practical things about mission work when we're talking about sending missionaries overseas and actually having them living there, not just going for a week or two on a mission trip, but actually uprooting their lives, moving their families overseas, and living there. That means they have to have a place to live, they have to have food to eat, all the things that we have here in order to do their work there. A lot of people have to give in order for that to happen. And that's what Paul is laying before the church at Corinth, that there is a need and somebody has to give in order to fulfill that need. And he holds up the churches of Macedonia as an example of churches that went beyond their means. I've shared with you already that the International Mission Board, the board that we support as Southern Baptist, this year, for the first time in my lifetime, and I believe for the first time ever, they have drastically cut their mission force. Of the roughly 5,000 missionaries that we have on the field right now that we're helping to support, by December 31st, 800 of them will be back home. That's almost a 20% cut in our mission force, just like that. And the sole reason for it is lack of money. Now, I'm not fussing at you because our church has been exemplary in our giving. Per capita, our church is one of the highest giving Baptist churches in California. So if every church gave like our church gave, we wouldn't be bringing missionaries back home. We'd be sending more missionaries overseas. If every Baptist in California gave like you give every year, we wouldn't be bringing missionaries home. So don't hear this as me fussing at you. Our church hasn't been the problem, but there is still a problem. We didn't cause it, but it's still there. And so I want to lay this need out before you and let you know of what's going on. Now, Mary and I have an amount that we give every year to this offering. And what we decided to do this year, we're going to give more. In fact, we're going to give double what we normally give. And it was a conversation that took about 5 seconds. I said, we'd been talking about all the cuts in missionaries, and I said, what do you think this year about giving double? And she said, I think that's a good idea. And there it was. Now, I'm not saying that you have to give double. You'll notice that several times in this passage, Paul mentions about giving according to your means. So what you give and how much you give, that's between you and the Lord. But I do want you to know about this need, and just as Paul laid out before the church at Corinth this need. And then look in verses 7 through 12, he encourages them, and it's interesting, he encourages them to use their money as a way of serving the Lord. And verse 7 is the key verse there, as he says, I want you to excel in the grace of giving. I love that, and as many times as I've read this passage before, I've never noticed that before. But he says, I want you to excel in the grace of giving. You know, I had a thought this week as I was writing this sermon. Giving is the only thing we do for the Lord that can be measured. Have you ever thought about that? Most of the things we do for the Lord, you can't put a ruler on them, you can't put an amount on them. But giving, you can. Giving, it's practical, isn't it? It comes down to an exact amount. Now, what your exact amount is going to be and what our exact amount is going to be, it's going to be different. But I do know this, and here's the spiritual principle that underlies all of this. A stingy Christian is a contradiction in terms. Because Paul ties giving with grace. He says the grace of giving. I've seen people over the course of my ministry who, not a lot fortunately, but they just want to hang on, and I'm talking about Christians now, who just want to hang on to everything they get and never let go of any of it. That's not how God wants us to live. A big part of why God blesses us is so that we can let go of it. Now you notice in verse 8, Paul says that giving should be voluntary. He says, I don't give this to you as a command. And I think what's in Paul's mind there is that he's saying God shouldn't have to pry out of your hands what he has placed into your hands. And I know that as a pastor, I don't like having to browbeat you about giving. And I've never had to be honest. I've never done that, and I don't see that I would ever need to. You've always been so generous. But, you know, preachers get that reputation of always talking about money, always asking for people about money. I love that old joke, even though it's a preacher joke, about the little boy who swallowed a quarter, and he was choking, and the mom said, quick, call the doctor. And the boy's dad said, no, call the preacher, he can get money out of anybody. That's a funny joke, and maybe some truth to it. But I want you to give, not because somebody's prying it out of you or somebody's twisting your arm or making you feel guilty. I want you to give out of the spirit of gratitude and thankfulness for what the Lord has done for you. And also, as he says in verse 9 here, verses 9 and 10, in following the example of Jesus, he points out how Jesus, who was rich, made himself poor. And so follow the example of Jesus, he says there, as you think about giving. Now, third thing, and here he really gets into the very practical nature of this. Look what he says in verse 13. He says that those who have been blessed should help those who are less fortunate. Now, I told you that Corinth was a very wealthy church and a very wealthy city. Corinth was a marvel of its time. He mentions the Macedonian churches that were very poor. This money was going to help Christians in Jerusalem who were suffering persecution, who didn't have even the very basic necessities of life. Now, what does all of that have to do with us here in America in 2015? Well, we've been blessed, haven't we, in America, materially. I did some research on the internet this week. I kind of knew this already, but I wanted to confirm it through research. According to both the Economist magazine, which is from London, and the New York Times business section, if you take the bottom group in America in terms of income, you take the bottom percent of America, the bottom 5%, okay? Now, that's low. When you get to the bottom 5% of income in America, is wealthier than 68% of the world's inhabitants. Our bottom 5 are richer than 68% of the world's inhabitants. If you make $10,000 a year, you are wealthier than 84% of the world. If you make $50,000 a year or more, you are wealthier than 99% of the world. When we talk about the poor here in America, most of our poor would be high middle class at least, and in some cases would be rich in other parts of the world. Most of the poor here in America have cell phones, they have TVs, they live in a place that has a roof with running water and electricity and indoor plumbing. As you know, our church every year around Thanksgiving in December, we try to help out people in the community as they come to us looking for whatever assistance they might need. We kind of stopped doing this a few years back when I got a call from a woman. She said her family was in dire straits and they really needed assistance. And I said, okay, well, you know, our church has set aside some money for this, and we have some gift cards for places where you can buy food and all that. So I said, you know, just come on over to the church and I'll hook you up there. And so she said, okay, well, what's your address? And I told her the address. And I said, do you, and I could hear her, she said, okay, I got it. And I said, do you want me to tell you how to get here? She was coming from West Covina. And she said, no, I'll just punch that address into my GPS. And sure enough, A little while later, here she comes rolling up into our parking lot in a brand new SUV that had GPS. And I looked at my car as I was out there. I'm driving a 13-year-old 5-speed Kia with torn upholstery. I thought, something's wrong here. Something's wrong here that she's coming here because she's in such rough straits. But that's the reality of what it's like to live here compared to what it's like to live in the rest of the world. I spent 8 days in El Salvador some years back on a mission trip. Man, I saw poverty. I couldn't believe it. Churches filled with people who couldn't even afford to buy shoes, who came to church, and they have this notion that we still sort of have here in America about, kind of putting on your good clothes when you go to church. And their good clothes looked like rags that we would just throw away or use for cleanup around the house. In Argentina, in the city we lived in, Buenos Aires, a city roughly the size of Los Angeles, that city has a ring around it of about 3.5 million people. They live in what are called in Spanish villas de miseria, which would be misery villages. They live in little shacks. No running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity. They walk to and from wherever they're going on dirt roads, no lights, street lights and all that. Once when we were in Argentina, when we had, not too long after we had arrived, and the International Mission Board that we're supporting with this offering, they let missionaries have a crate of goods that you can bring with you overseas, basic necessities that you're going to need there. And when our crate arrived, it was unloaded and we put those things into our house. And I didn't want the wood to go to waste. It was cheap wood. It's what they call pressed plywood. It's not even true wood. It's just kind of pressed, sawdust and things like that. But still, I didn't want it to go to waste, so I thought I'll chop it up with an axe. And our house had a fireplace in it, and I thought I'll burn it in the fireplace to keep us warm. So I'm out in the yard with my axe chopping on it, and a man comes walking by, an Argentine, and he says, "What are you going to do with that wood?" I said, "No." And by the way, I'm talking about a crate that would have been no bigger than that piano over there. It wasn't big. And I said, "Well, I'm going to chop it up and use it for firewood." And he said, "Can I have it?" I said, "Well, it depends on what are you going to do with it. What are you going to do with it if I give it to you?" And he said, "I'm going to make a house out of it. I'm going to live in it." So I said, "Yeah, you can have it." Absolutely. See, that's what it's like overseas. So I know that sometimes we may feel like we're not doing so well, but brothers, we are, compared to how the rest of the world is doing. And that's what Paul is saying here when he reminds the Corinthians about how much they have been blessed and how poor some others are doing. And then look, he wraps it up in verses 14 and 15 by saying, there's a reason God has blessed you, because he wants you to bless others. That's one of the great things about giving. It is first and foremost something we do for the Lord, but it's also a tangible way of blessing others. To take what God has given to us, what God has put in our hands, and to say, "God, I'm going to let go of some of this so that it can be a blessing to others." Paul even says in the book of Ephesians that being able to give to others is one of the reasons we should work. Paul says in Ephesians 4:28 that Christians should work doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Now, we always think about, working as providing for ourselves, and it is that first and foremost. But Paul takes that a step further and says you should also work so that when you come across people who are in need, you have something to share with them. And one of the things I love about this offering and why I always promote it so strongly every year is that every penny that this church collects, we give to the mission field. We don't keep a single penny of it here. Now look, like every other pastor, I spend some time each week thinking about how much money we have, how much money we don't have, budgets, are we going to have enough, and all of that. Every pastor spends time thinking about that. But you know what? It's wonderful to be relieved of that and to just say, Lord, here's an offering we're not keeping for ourselves. We're giving this away. And every bit that comes in, we're sending back out to the mission field. One of the things I notice about these TV evangelists, every now and then I torment myself and I'll turn one of them on. Benny Hinn and Robert Tilden. You ever notice these guys that for you to prove your faith, you always have to send money to them. They never tell you to take $100 and go feed the poor with it, or take $500 and send it to the mission field. You always have to give it to them to prove your faith. One of the things I love about this mission, this offering, is that it's not for us. It's for somebody else. And we take it and we let go of it, give it away. And I think there's a wonderful spiritual lesson that sometimes God puts something in our hands, not for us to keep, but for us to let go and to give it to somebody else. Now, let me wrap up by saying this. This money that you give, what is it going to do? Well, obviously it goes to support the missionaries, keep them on the field. So what do? Well, they start churches. They evangelize, they teach the Bible. The Word of God changes lives, and that's true here and it's true elsewhere. They feed the hungry. They give clothing to those who don't have it. They help the poor. They educate the uneducated, particularly in training seminary students. They minister to the sick. Some work in agriculture to help people learn to grow crops. Some dig wells. Some install latrines. But most of all, what they do is they tell others about Jesus. One day I was at a store in Argentina when we were missionaries there. And though we were speaking in Spanish, the man could tell from my accent that I was not from Argentina. So he said, I can tell you're not from here. Where are you from? And I told him where I was from. And he said, well then, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm a Baptist missionary. And he said, well then tell me, what have you come to do? What is your message? And the message I shared with him was the message of Jesus Christ. And that's what our missionaries do. Whatever else they're doing, it is always ultimately for the purpose of sharing the gospel with the lost. And giving helps us be a part of that. That's why in verse 4 of our text, Paul mentions what some of your translations would say in the fellowship of giving. Some of the translations say about sharing in this word. It's a word that literally means to have a partnership. And I love that thought that when we give through this offering, we are engaging in a partnership with our missionaries. And whatever they do, we do because of our partnership. And so if you were to ask me, what am I going to do this week? Let me tell you some of the things I'm going to do this week. I'm going to help perform an operation at the Baptist Hospital in Nigeria. I'm going to witness to an unreached Indian tribe in the Amazon jungle. I'm going to help construct a building for a new church in the Philippines. I'm going to teach a class to the next generation of pastors at the Baptist Seminary in Argentina. I'm going to provide Bibles in Chinese for a new church in China. I'm going to lead an evangelistic crusade in South Korea. I'm going to help dig a well in a village in Senegal so that that village will have its first supply of clean well water. I'm going to start a new church in Moscow. And I'm going to share the gospel with a Muslim in Iraq. Now, how am I going to do all that even in the jet age Nobody can do all that in 1 week, but I am, and so are you, when you give through this offering, because that's what our missionaries are going to be doing this week. That and a whole lot more. And when we give, we share in the partnership of what the Lord is doing on the mission field through them. So I hope you will prayerfully consider your gift this year. Give what the Lord lays upon your heart to give. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 95. It's a Christmas hymn. Go Tell It on the Mountain. Let's